Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this exciting talk on cataloguing and classification ethics. I'm Victoria Parkinson. I am the chair of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. And today's event is organised by us as a part of a series of events. And you can see the recordings of our previous sessions on the ARLIS YouTube channel. And you keep an eye out for future sessions we're running next year. So thank you very much to the other members of the committee for helping to organise this. A little bit of housekeeping. We're muting everyone as they come in. Please keep your video off. That just helps save everyone's bandwidth. So don't worry about not having a microphone or anything. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions. So if you put them in the chat box as you think of them, at the end I'll read them out and we'll answer what we can. So let me give an introduction to Debbie. Deborah Lee is a senior teaching fellow at University College London, and where among other things she leads the cataloguing, classification and knowledge organisation modules. Her research areas include knowledge organisation of music, the theory of knowledge organisation systems, art information organisation and cataloguing education. Prior to that, she was the senior cataloguer and joint acting head of the book library at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and until June 2021 she was the co-chair of this committee. So thank you very much, Debbie. Take it away.
Hello, thank you so much. So you're going to do the bit where I'm going to look at my slides and we'll laugh when it goes wrong. Might go right first time. And there we go. Oh, first time. And just letting the top menu go away. Wow, it worked. Always a moment of great pleasure when that happens. So thank you so much for that introduction, Victoria. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. When I just put the slides on, I think it was 128 people, which is just amazing. Cataloguing and classification ethics. I mean, it's such an important, such a timely subject, and it's such a wide subject. And those of you who got here a bit early will have heard myself chatting to other committee members, Victoria and our chair, Victoria, and to Katie, about just how interesting it's been for me putting together this material. I teach a lot of it, but putting it together into one short introduction, to me just proved, if I didn't need it proving already, that this is just such a big topic. So that asks really, what am I trying to do today? What are we trying to do in this introduction? Well, it's very much an introduction and it's going to be very short compared to how much material there is. But what I'm trying to do today is to offer an overview, an entire overview and a framework about which we can think about our cataloguing and classification questions. So that's the first aim. The second aim is to maybe give a little bit about some of the conceptual ideas behind what we see. So I think all of us are here because we know, I'm assuming, but many of us are here at least, because we know that we've got some really problematic classification schemes. Don't worry, I'm going to get onto Dewey Decimal Classification a bit later. We know we've got these problems. And what I'm going to try and do is to articulate some of the theoretical, conceptual reasons why that might be the case. And interestingly, some of the literature and analysis which is going on. And that brings me very much to what I think about as being the third aim to this introduction, which is to maybe alert people to some of the really interesting lines of analysis, lines of research which go on in my subdiscipline of knowledge organisation. So what goes on in library and information science research about some ethical issues in cataloguing classification. And actually this whole area has introduced some new methodologies actually in analysing classification schemes. So although I can't go into detail about every issue and every topic or even mention, there's going to be so much which isn't mentioned. What I'm hoping to provide is an overview, a kind of mapping and a framework for some of the areas of this very, very rich topic. And then from that, what I'm hoping is that those of you engaged with projects or thinking about projects or have been very concerned about what you've seen or like reading about it or writing about it, it gives a kind of a framework and an introduction. So that's what I'm hoping. So that's what we're going to try and do by the end. Now, just a few technical, practical things. The first is that, as you know, this presentation is being recorded, but also we will be sending around the slides. I'm sure they're not so pretty, you want to look at them again. But at the end of the slides, I have got a list of references that I'm going to refer to, if all goes well. And I've also got some tips for finding literature. One of the big issues I hear being discussed about library and information science literature is you hear something good, hopefully. You hear something good. You hear an article that you want to read, but if you're in an institution which doesn't have access to library and information science collections, you can't necessarily follow up on that article. So there's a few tips at the very end of the presentation, not the presentation, at the end of the slides, about how you might go about looking for some of the references, if any of them kind of take your interest, spark your interest in going to read more. So that is enough of the introduction. What am I going to be talking about? Well, I'm going to start with a very, very brief introduction to the ideas of cataloguing and classification ethics. And at this point, I'm going to mention some terminology, which is the real title should have been cataloguing, subject indexing, or just indexing, and classification ethics. I got a bit bored of writing that out each time. So every time I talk about cataloguing ethics or cataloguing classification ethics, I actually mean everything. So I mean things like LCSH, other forms of subject indexing, classification schemes, cataloguing, really anything we might traditionally think about as being a cataloger or a metadata librarian or something like that. So sometimes I haven't written out the whole title because it gets a bit wordy, but basically I'm talking about all of this area and the ethics of all of it. So that's the very beginning, and that's going to be a short introduction. The second section, I'm going to talk about some of the ethical issues with the design of cataloguing guidelines and classification systems, etc. So this is all about how did Dewey get into the mess that it is, or something like that, and looking at some of the theory behind that and what's going on, and some of the really, really rich and interesting analysis of it. The third section is taking the other side of that and is looking at the ethical issues with actually doing the cataloguing, index and classifying, which in some cases actually involves using some of those schemes, but more on that in a minute. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk about the wider context and really kind of what barriers there might be to doing projects, why we need to do projects to try and fix this, and what barriers there might be. And I'm hopefully going to be finishing on a very hopeful slide where it's very optimistic about some of the progress that we've made, because I know in this area, there's so much which is wrong, there's so much which is offensive and unethical. And I just want us not to lose sight on the fact that I think it's really exciting what's actually happening to make things better, and to explore and to analyze and all the research on this area. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for amongst all of this. One small disclaimer, which is in this presentation, I'm not really going to be talking about what's right and wrong, what we should do, what's dreadful, what's really offensive. I'm going to be talking in quite an abstract way about the various projects, and I'm going to be presenting problems to doing things. I just want everyone to know that I don't think, I'm not telling you my views on what we should or shouldn't be doing, or what's more important than other things. This is really about looking at the issues, kind of delving down deeply into what's going on, rather than saying we shouldn't do this or we should do this. There should not be the word should in this whole presentation. Just wanted you to be aware of that is the context in which I'm presenting this. There's obviously a lot of very understandable anger about some of these issues, but I'm not going into that side of things today. There will be other opportunities for us to talk about some of the actual solutions and activism, but that's not the sort of purpose of today. So I will be talking in quite an abstract way, which isn't really advocating for doing one thing or the other generally. Just so you know that, and don't think that's my personal opinion. So hope your screen has gone dark pink, and it's really, I'm liking the pink glow here. It's really quite fun. So an introduction to the ideas of cataloguing and classification ethics. The very first question, of course, is what do we mean by the word ethics in this context? So any of you who've studied philosophy, this won't be new at all, but it's quite interesting because it turns out that we don't really often define what we mean by cataloguing ethics. We have this whole area of practice and research. We don't actually always define what it means. So generally we could say one definition, and this comes from Fox and Rees's article from 2012. I've drawn some ideas from that. It's on the resources slide. The ethics in cataloguing is really a sense of right and wrong, or it's to do with morality, or this idea of the moral dimension. And there are other views about this, but generally that's what we're working with. So when you see the word the ethics of cataloguing, it's basically anything which is looking at that moral dimension, anything which is looking at what might be right or wrong. That's really kind of what we're talking about. And it's interesting, this Fox and Rees article from 2012, they say, certainly when they were writing in 2012, the whole area, but we haven't really defined what we mean. They call it quite a loose a loose definition, very loosely. This is what they picked up from the literature. Fascinating to look at how it hasn't really been strictly defined, or at least certainly not in 2012, where we already had quite a lot of research. I think that's interesting. The second thing I wanted to say is that in this presentation, I am making this division, this structural division between what's on the left, the design of the guidelines and the systems, and what's on the right, which is doing the cataloguing, indexing, and classification, and often applying those very same guidelines and systems that are on the left. Now, in some ways, this is a bit of an artificial division. If you're working in a library which has its own classification scheme, then on any 1 hour, you might be working on the design of your classification scheme, adding a new number, and then, 10 minutes later, you're then cataloguing something. But I think it's a really, really important division. And we're going to see as we go through that some of the areas of interest and some of the developments are very much about changing the guidelines and the systems, either structurally or changing certain areas of them. And some of the things we're talking about are what we can do when we're actually in the library, or not in the library, virtually in the library, cataloguing and classifying and indexing things. And some of those are to do with applying. Should we apply this offensive term or not? Should we change our classification? And some are actually more general issues. I'm going to get onto that. There's some really interesting general ethical issues to do with cataloguing, which may be nothing to do with using Dewey or using LCSH or using your own system or something like that. So I'm making that division, and that division is definitely a kind of a research choice of my own to make that, but I think it's a really, really, really useful division. So what does ethics apply to in cataloguing and indexing and classification and lots of other things? What does it apply to? Is it something that if you work in a certain sector or a certain library or a certain type of material you have to worry about, but nothing else you do? Do you only have to worry about it for certain subjects? Well, the short answer is, what does it apply to? It applies to everything. Potentially everything has a moral dimension when you're cataloguing and classifying it. And hopefully I will persuade you of that point by the end, not all the way through, but by the end, there's some slides certainly near the end, but I hope I'll persuade you of that. However, and you know this however is coming, there's a big but here, but we know that often ethical issues and problematic areas in the ethical dimension happen much more often for groups of people, and particularly marginalized groups of people. So while yes, there are all sorts of interesting ethical dimensions with all sorts of areas of cataloguing, we do know that a lot of the problems are to do with the unethical treatment of certain groups of people, and usually these are marginalized groups. So here are some examples. Some of these may be very familiar. Some characteristics are race and gender, sexuality, migration status, more about that later. Religion often gets left out, but religion can be a real problem. Disability and ability. Indigenous communities, particularly important if you're working, but not exclusively, but in America, Canada and Australia, that's a very, very big issue there. Vulnerable groups of all descriptions, and just generally geographic regions. There's so much to say about the cataloguing, classification, ethics of geographic regions, more on that in the next few slides time, and particularly sort of that focus on the global north, and focusing really, on a world which only consists of the global north and all those sorts of problems. So ethics, everything, but we will find a lot of the discussions, a lot of the papers, a lot of the research, a lot of the issues you're trying to fix in your library are likely to concern marginalized groups. So that's, I think, very, very interesting in its own right. And finally, in this section, okay, what is our ethical stance? Oh, and this, it gets really interesting. So for many years, we thought our ethical stance, of course, we're all neutral. We are librarians. We're neutral, the arbiters of truth. We're trustworthy. What was that poll out yesterday? Second most trustworthy profession. We're trustworthy, etc., etc. But the idea of neutrality is really coming under fire now. And I think many of us would say we're not designed to be neutral, we're not meant to be neutral. I think 2016 article by Jens Erik May, great thinker, amazing philosopher and thinker, based in Copenhagen, again, reference at the end, he says that we can't really move on with our classification schemes until we accept we're not neutral. And there's another quote from Melissa Adler on there as well, I think, which is also about neutrality and how it's basically impossible to be neutral. We really can't have both, and we have the the moral obligation to also be activists as well. So very interesting, her writings. Again, on the resource list, I'm sure many of you have seen them, but Melissa Adler is another amazing author in this field. So neutrality, we think we want it, but actually we're going to see, and through some of the examples, that neutrality is not necessarily something we're aiming for now, but it is a very ingrained idea to librarians generally, but particularly into cataloguing. So that's kind of fascinating. Factual, of course, we only say what's really there. Or do we? So there's some really interesting work I don't have time to talk about today by Karen Snow, who talks about things like false memoirs, where what we think is factual is not factual. So this gets really interesting. I think we'll all agree we'll try and be factual, but not so easy to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about that with artistic deceptions and fictive art and things like that. And also, ideally, and this is coming out a little bit more, I think, in cataloguing world. It's been, I think, known about for a long time elsewhere, but in the cataloguing world, about the idea of who is creating the knowledge organization, who's creating the descriptions, and the idea of situating that within the communities which the knowledge is made. And this idea comes up a lot in lots of marginalized groups, but I think it's coming up a lot. I've seen it a lot in writings about Indigenous communities and work with trying to get in classifications about Indigenous communities working so that it actually, the knowledge is within the knowledge framework of that Indigenous community. For example, that's just one example, but it does come out a lot in that. So we're going to get that point. We'll circle back to that point later in one of the examples. So that is potentially part of our ethical stance, but we're going to get onto codes of ethics later, where we'll look at that in a bit more detail. So more bright pink glow. So the first thing I want to look at out of the two halves are the ethical issues with the design of the cataloguing guidelines and classification systems. So this is not, should we use this term or not, or how should I deal with this, but this is about our classification schemes, things like Dewey Decimal Classification, our cataloguing guidelines, and before that our cataloguing rules, things like RDA, ACR2, our rules for name authority control, part of which are in RDA, part of which are in things like NACO and manual and things. So these are about the design of the systems, either generally the design of a classification scheme or the design of specific systems and vocabularies, things like the name authority file. So this is what we're talking about now. So I thought I'd start off with a good old one here, which is the Dewey Decimal Classification. It's almost a cliche. I had great fun doing this slide. I was just writing down the first 6, I think I've got 6 unethical things I could think of. I honestly could have filled a full presentation with it. So I don't know, then in no particular order of importance or disgrace, we have Christianity dominating the religion schedules, the difference in number of classes for one culture's literature over another's. I used an amazing but horrifying example of this in teaching last week, where we looked at Dewey. I think I calculated that French literature had, I think, 100 times as many classes as Arabic literature, for example. So that came up in one of the activities. That was, as I said, horrifying, but quite useful for teaching. A lot of these are great for teaching, just horrific in terms of what they say about us. What counts as a religion? Seeing some cultures, what they would count as religion being, I would say, like, demoted to folklore, but certainly, not treated as religion. We have a very Western-centric Christian idea, perhaps a Judeo-Christian-centric idea of what religion is. So we see some people's cultures being said, well, that's folklore, that's not religion. So we have that, I think, with Wicca and paganism. We have it some Indigenous religions as well. I could go on. And historically, homosexuality being included as a social deviance, obviously very problematic. Is better. So I would say some of these haven't changed. Some of these are so embedded in the structure they haven't been able to change. Some of these have been changed over the years, thank goodness, but we could argue not enough. Women being added additionally to topics. So as another, so artists are male, but but occasionally you might have a female artist, and colonial geographic subdivisions. So you work very hard perhaps on getting your names in the culture of the place. And then you just divide through, a very colonialist geographic structure to get through there. And I could go on, and I could just sit on this slide for about half an hour, but I better not. But this just shows you just some of the just few of the examples in Dewey Decimal Classification, many of which I know you will all know about. But what's going on there? That's what I'm interested in. What's going on? So what I want to talk about is what sort of ethical issues are present in cataloguing classification systems. We can all we all know that they're there. We can see them when we're working with it. We're embarrassed when we talk to our patrons and things like this. But, what's going on? Well, here's a kind of a, I wouldn't say a typology, it's a bit, you know, a bit more technical than a sort of a list, the list that I bought, but let's have a look at some of these ideas and delineate between them. So one of the problems is coverage. So often we find less marginalized groups receive more space. I think Arabic and French poetry or Arabic and French literature examples show that. Problematic terminology, offensive labels for groups of people or individuals or places. Now, this is very interesting because I used an example of Dewey Decimal Classification, which is bad enough. But when you come to other sorts of knowledge organization systems, such as our favorite, the Library of Congress subject headings, or any other terminology, any other form of subject heading or thesaurus, these become even more problematic. Now, it's bad enough that you've got a classification scheme such as Dewey with offensive terminology in, potentially. But mostly the users don't see it unless you're idiotic enough to put that terminology on your shelf ends and display it to your users. It's not very good, and it's not good at all. But at least it's not something in the users see automatically. And what I think is really interesting about some of the discussions about problematic vocabulary, for example, around illegal aliens in LCSH, is that we see it much more because it's in the terminology used on the catalogue. It's in words, not numbers. No one's probably offended by 333.5, even though that might represent the most awful hierarchy ever. I'm making up Dewey numbers now, I do that. But, you know, it might represent the most awful problem, but it's a number, so people don't see it, but they do see an offensive term. So I think the second one is very interesting because it's much more visible. The third one, our example, is problematic hierarchies. So, for example, subdividing through a place where people are not really in agreement that really, you know, one place owns the other place. And a lot of problems here with colonial geographic structures as well. And again, it is a problem and it is seen by users, but it's probably less obvious and less explicit than problematic terminology. Real problem. This is what a lot of the discussion and literature has been about in something like and Dewey. Cultural bias. We assume that Western systems of knowledge are the most important. This is how we end up with our idea of religion, perhaps, rather than a more global idea of religion. Categorizations of people, generally never a good idea. But I'm in a second talk about an example with RDA there, where, you know, specifying gender where it's unnecessary and then can be quite hurtful and problematic for people. A lot of othering goes on. So this is where the example of assuming the artist is male goes on there, really. We assume all artists are male, and then the other is the female, so we have to say woman artist. So that can be very problematic. That's very interesting from a theoretical perspective. And there's a slightly more technical idea called warrant, but let me just explain what that is. Most terminologies, vocabularies, classification schemes, such as Dewey, LCSH, subject headings, they have rules about what goes into, what counts as a subject to go in there. And the basis, the justification for putting those terms in or not having them in at all is what we call a warrant. It's a warrant for inclusion. There's all sorts, but these can often bring some ethical problems, because if your warrant is about published knowledge, then you find that all the prejudices and the unethical behavior of the publishing industry about whose voice is heard and who gets their works published, or what works we have about people of one race or one gender, this all again gets reflected in the knowledge organization systems and the classification schemes. So actually, warrant can cause its own problems, because it sounds like a good idea in theory, but all you're doing is using justification from potentially other unethical systems. So that's a really, really interesting one. And there's some great works about warrant, which you can find. And I think I've listed a few somewhere. Yes, that was the point I made about being very explicit to users. For anyone who's got the right-hand side of their screen, they can see a nice wiggly arrow there. So very, very quickly, a second example would be the problems about including information about gender in name authority records. Again, using a technical term here, a name authority record is a bit of Mark 21 coding, which describes a person, so that all the books say by that person get linked to that one record for the name. It sits slightly separately from the record from the books, and they all link to this person. Now, the problem is that lots of people have very similar names. In name authority records, we like to what we call disambiguate, try and separate out different actual people. And unfortunately, one of the ways that we do that is by listing their gender, for example, or perhaps listing all of their names or something like that. And this causes some unethical problems. So some of the problems you get are, for example, including dead names where people don't want those names to be included, but actually there's some other ways that you don't want a certain name to be on a system. The fact that RDA has at various points required you to include gender, so you record the gender and you don't get many choices about what genders they are. That's very, very problematic, very offensive to people who maybe don't want their gender to be recorded or don't fit into those categories. And there is a really big question about why you need gender to start with. Is that the best way to disambiguate from one person to another? And what this brings up is really interesting, is the idea of the rights of the author or the creator. I mean, very book-centric here, but it's easier than saying director, singer, actor, everything. Just imagine, let's just stick with books. So maybe an author. What this brings up is the issue of the rights of the author versus the rights of the users and the librarians. And do the authors have rights? And traditionally, not really in this area. And it brings up this issue of power, which is very, very important. So this is a really interesting discussion going on. I've recommended one useful resource. Violet Fox and Kelly Swickard actually discuss something slightly different. They don't specifically discuss gender. They're discussing a lot of things about protests and activists and safety and privacy. But the issues they describe is really, really fascinating. And that, again, I've put on the list of resources, but that's really, really interesting article to have a look, book chapter to have a look at. So that's a second example of ethical problems with the design of our systems. So you sitting in the library, unless you have rights to change the name authority file, can't do much probably with it, apart from see this and worry about it and be concerned about it. Because this is all to do with the design of the systems themselves and the rules which go behind that design, as well as individual entries. But it's usually about the structure, the overall structure and the rules and the guidelines. So that is another example of a problem, an ethical problem. So get your sunglasses ready for, oh no, there was one more slide. Comes next, bright pink coming up. Okay, so there are some really serious problems with the design of systems. But what is really, really interesting is that there's some lots and lots of work going on, and has been for the last 10, 20 years at least. Actually, some of these references are much earlier, to analyze and to understand what's going on behind the design of unethical systems. So maybe not looking at one term and another, but one big issue over another, and looking at how we go about understanding what's going on. The first thing I want to say is that this is a long-standing research area. So we haven't just discovered ethics in the last 10 years. We're certainly going in new directions, and really exciting things are happening, and lots of changes and a mood for real change and social justice is great. But the discussions and the analysis have been going on nearly 50 years. Well, actually, exactly 50 years. Sandy Berman is a really, really key author. And his book Antipathies and Antipathies is back from 1971. It's probably discussions maybe earlier, but this is really kind of seen as one of the first works. So it's a long-standing research area. People have done some really, really deep analysis of certain systems. Melissa Adler, her book on the Library of Congress classification, which takes a critical theory approach to understanding the treatment of sexuality in the Library of Congress, absolutely fascinating work. And we've got Billy Javinsky's and Roberto's article about this whole inclusion of gender information in RDA, which was my previous example. So that's really interesting too. And honestly, there are so many examples I could have put here. It was very difficult to just limit it to two, and actually the slide is too full. I should have just done one, but I just couldn't leave either of these two out. But these are just examples of some of the really deep analysis that's gone on in this area. So people looking at problematic bit of some sort of set of guidelines or system within cataloging, classification and indexing, and looking and understanding what's going on, often drawing from theory in other areas. Some really, really fascinating research. So going beyond, we know there's a problem, to taking it to the next stage. Sometimes, often within an LIS research sphere, but sometimes by practitioners as well. It's a real mix there. Another interesting thing to explore is how systems have changed over time. Because yes, we know that Dewey is bad, we know that. But what's interesting is to explore how it's changed over time. Because, we sometimes, very rarely feeling charitable about Dewey these days as a community. But if we were, we might say, designed in times, the 19th century, and things were different, etc., etc. But what this line of research does is take systems such as Dewey. A lot of this research has been on Dewey, actually, not all, a lot has, and look at how things have changed. So, is it okay to say that there was a problematic term in the 1930s, but actually all the literature had gone around changing it? So what this sort of research does is track the changes over time within the kind of changes going on generally in Dewey, and often track those changes against what was going on in the published literature and in theory and culture. So the classic article on this, although it's not the first article, and he wrote about it earlier, is Joe Tennis's article about eugenics from 2012. He looks at this very problematic area of research and term called eugenics and where it fits into Dewey, and it actually moves around from being treated as science, I know, to other things which are slightly more palatable. And of course, the problem is that we need our systems and guidelines to cover really, really unethical topics like eugenics. We want to keep the books about eugenics, they're an important part of the development of thought, a horrible part, but that, you know, I would argue, but they need to be there and you need to deal with them. But it's really, really interesting looking at how historically these schemes have changed. And what you end up seeing is that, yes, this is about ethics, but it actually tells you a lot about the history of thought as well. And our classification schemes, particularly older ones like Dewey Decimal Classification, actually track the history of thought over time. And this method is called ontogeny, which is borrowed from, I think it's from biology or philosophy, I can't remember, but it's called ontogeny. And there's a bunch of literature about which uses this method. But it's really, really interesting, showing you how ethical problems have actually sort of helped us to understand sort of the history of thought more generally, outside of just classification schemes, the history of thoughts more generally. This is really, really interesting, and understanding how we've got to the schemes we've got today. So we might look at Dewey today and go, oh my God, it's so unethical. But it's very interesting looking at some of this research about how terms got there and how they've changed and how they've got worse and how they've got better, and can we make the excuse when it's of its time and things like that. So this is a really, really fascinating area of research. And then finally, we have some general works about theories and philosophies of ethical issues. Again, really, really hard to choose here. But Hope Olson is one of the big authors here. I've included her feminist analysis of subjects, but she's written a lot about women and feminism, and using feminist theory to analyze classification and cataloging and indexing. So that's really cool. And again, Jens Erik May talks about Olson's work, but actually goes further, brings it together and to come up with a theory of kind of systematic bias, and looking at that within classification schemes or knowledge organization systems more generally. So very negative in the sense that we've got some really unethical systems and guidelines out there. We might sometimes wonder how on earth we've got them and why doesn't no one do anything about it. But we do have this body of research which analyzes them, and maybe something that you all will be interested in adding to, writing dissertations about or writing articles about as well. So there's a real collection of research and a discourse going on about these, about some of our systems and guidelines. And now put your sunglasses on, it's bright pink time. So the second part of the two is to look at the application, the actual doing of the cataloguing, classification and indexing, and looking at some of the work that's been done on the framework of sort of ethical works about this. Again, I would say that it's divided, there's lots of areas, but two main areas which seem to emerge when you look at this literature are those which talk about codes of ethics for cataloguing or cataloguers. I had a great discussion in a class earlier today about this, about the wording. But looking at sort of your responsibilities and your conduct and your code of practice as the person doing it. And there's another really interesting body of work which looks at different collections or types of very problematic situations or scenarios or formats. So I'm just going to have a quick tour through those. A code of ethics for cataloguing, again, is a bit of a long-standing topic, and it's really exciting right now because we actually do have an international-ish, English-speaking international-ish, cataloguing code of ethics. But it's been a bit of a journey to get there, as you can see here from this slide. So we have an article in 2005 by Baer, which suggests this is a good thing to do. It's a very seminal article, but you know, it's written, some problem with it as being the code itself is that it's written by one person, and there's a kind of desire, which Shoemaker says in 2015, that we need a code of ethics, but we want it to be drawn up by groups of librarians. So it's kind of interesting. And between those two, though, we have the IFLA Statement of International Cataloguing Principles, shortened to the ICP. Now, these are generally about cataloguing, but contain some really, really interesting things about ethics. So they're not specifically for ethics, but they're very, very interesting. So they say that the convenience of the user is the most important thing, which I think is fascinating. And they talk about representation of the resource, and they also talk about accuracy. Now, some of those might, for your average well-behaved textbook, as if there's ever one of those, but let's imagine, some of those might not seem that interesting. But in some examples I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, some of those ideas about representation and accuracy aren't so easy to carry out, particularly if you're working in an art library. So that's very, very interesting. But after sort of growing out of all of this work, in 2018, conversations started about making a cataloguing code of ethics. I think the ALA, the American Library Association, have possibly already been talking about it, but they approached CILEP. I was at one of the very, very initial meetings. And then lots of working groups, sadly, I didn't have time to join, but some working groups worked on these in 2019, 2020. And we now have a published final draft. Oh, it's not final draft, a final version of a cataloguing code of ethics. And interestingly, it's a joint initiative between the UK, USA, and Canada. So one of the things we should look at or think about is when we're thinking about what I'd call applied ethics, this idea of our ethics in practice as we're cataloguing and classifying things. I think it's interesting to think about who is involved with the applied ethics, who does it apply to, and who are those ethics for? So they're interesting questions to keep in mind. But let's have a quick look at that code of ethics. And again, no time to look at it. No time to look at everyone. So I've taken the highlights, and I'm really sorry. I'm sure there might be people here who came up with the code. Sorry if I've missed out everyone's favorite points. It has 10 points to it. Lots of discussion about what goes into it and listing people and everything. But the actual code, if you want to have a look, is 1 page. So it's really interesting, very quick to read. You can read it on the bus, etc., etc. I've taken out some interesting points here. There are other interesting points. I've just highlighted the ones I want to talk about. So my screen is not quite showing me. The first one is we catalogue, whoops, sorry. We catalogue and classify for the sake of users and to facilitate access and promote discovery. I can't quite see it on the screen, but I'm kind of improvising now. I think it's what it says. Now I've rung the words end user there because remember, the International Code of Cataloguing Principles had the end users on there, had the users on there as number 1. It is the first point in this, but actually there's no real priority in this code of cataloguing. So I think it's very interesting that the end users appear there right at the beginning. It's the users appear at the beginning of our code of cataloguing. So I think that's really, really interesting. And the second one, I think it's interesting, we commit to describing resources without discrimination while respecting the privacy and preferences of their associate agents. Now, this point is fascinating because the first draft that I saw of this code, I think the one that was discussed as it came out, didn't have this point at all, didn't have the word agents in it as far as I know, but it certainly didn't have this point. But I definitely commented on it, but I'm sure many other people did. I'm sure more articulately than me, in more articulate ways than I did anyway. So it's really fascinating this has been included. So we're talking here about not discriminating. Privacy comes up here, which is a real issue in the example that I used about gender and authority records. That was a real issue about privacy and people getting to choose for themselves how they're represented in these name authority files, which, let's face it, open publicly, open access to anybody. So I think it's really interesting this point is here. We need to think about the authors, the agents, the directors, the performers, whatever, and the editors and everything else. But we need to think about their privacy and their preferences and their choice. So I've rung the word agents there because that's another set of people who become involved. The third one is about acknowledging the biases that we bring and that we're trying to overcome them, not just on a personal level, on an institutional level, which is interesting. And number 8 is here. See here, I've skimmed down 4, 5, 6, and 7. Number 8 is all about diversity, equity, so EDI work in the workplace. Now, I think 3 and 8 are interesting because they talk about behaviors of the workplace themselves. There's a question, how much control can we have? We took this to our bosses, would we be able to do anything? So this is very interesting about how far the code extends. And, we're moving beyond what we do when we sit and catalogue something. And do we go for what will help the user over what is honest? Those sorts of questions. We're talking about the whole environment and way in which we catalogue. Now, some of the ones I've missed out, I think talk a little bit more about that, about equitable access to sources and things. And this comes up at the end of number 8 as well. Training, pay, fair work. Very, very nice. But I'm not sure as cataloguers how much say we get over these things. So what's interesting here is that we're going from being individual cataloguers and our code of practice to thinking about the code of practice within the workplace. So I think it's very interesting that it's all about the workplace now. So this code doesn't just apply to us as individuals. And finally, we work with our user communities and to understand the needs in order to provide relevant and timely service. Now, this is fascinating. Because you might remember all the way back to slide number 4, something like that, when I talked about our ethical stance and that there was a move towards thinking about cataloguing and classification from the perspective and working with our communities and all the different communities. And this actually brings us all the way around to that idea. Now, why I think it's interesting is that most of the points on this code are really about what you do when you sit down and catalogue. It's about your individual efforts, your sort of the applied cataloguing and classification. It's very much about what you do when you're cataloguing, indexing, classifying, rather than designing systems such as Dewey Decimal Classification. But this last point really brings us to the idea of the design of systems, because this is also relevant to design of systems. So I think this is really interesting. And the second point I take away from this, the code, is just how many different groups are being talked about here, that we see agents being mentioned, and we see our users being mentioned, although not quite as prioritized perhaps as they have been in other works on principles. But I do wonder how feasible it is to talk about what we can do to the workplace. I think it's very admirable, but I do wonder what we can do there. So I think that's quite interesting. And I think the final point is, thinking about this, about what's weighted, what isn't here, and how are different things weighted in here. So again, that idea that the users are there, but so are our working conditions. So I think that's quite an interesting point to make about this. But there's a lot which is very, very interesting about this code of practice. I'll be interested to hear if people have used it or seen it or using it to maybe negotiate some things in their departments or something like that. So it's quite an interesting point. So finally, this section, a couple of examples of some of the practical ethical decisions that you might make when you're doing your cataloguing. And these are the ones, this is the other type of literature that you get, which is literature looking at particularly problematic types of things or formats or situations, scenarios. The first is, or example 3, is when you're being asked, something comes to your trolley, your shelf, gets put there when overnight, when you can't see it, someone's dumped it and run usually. When it's what we might call a bad work, and I put that in inverted commas. So something which is where the work supports or legitimizes what most people would consider to be an unsavory or unethical subject area. So example might be a book about Holocaust denial, or a book about Nazism, or I had a lovely example from my class this morning, a school library which had Mein Kampf in it or something like that. Sorry, all those examples are quite similar. And so this is very, very interesting. It affects a number of bits of the record. Notably, I'd say, do you write a note? Do you warn the readers? Do you put any warning on there? Do you warn them there's a problem? And the second thing is, what do you do about subject headings? And do you sort of mitigate for those in any way at all? And I think they're probably the main cataloguing decisions you have to make. And then, of course, you've got the classification issue about whether you keep it on the open shelves or put it in restricted area. So this brings up a number of different ethical issues in cataloguing. The neutrality of the catalogue, whether the catalogue should be neutral or should have those sorts of notes in it. Should it warn people? Should it show the opinion of the people cataloguing it, that this requires a warning? And also the responsibilities of the library catalogue, because conversely, is it the catalogue's responsibility to warn people? And Homan's written a really interesting article about that one. And the second example I want to use is one about what we might call unreal works, or Antoinette Lafarge calls fictive art. And this is one I really love because I've written about it. So I'm really sorry the references to my work here. Sorry about that. But I think it's an interesting topic. Obviously, I've written about it. But I'd say this one is putting us firmly within the realm of being an artist talk. Because this one I think comes up quite a bit in art libraries. So these are situations where you've been asked to catalogue something like an exhibition catalogue, and it refers to an exhibition which may or may not have taken place, and someone's made up a few artists which don't exist, and it's referring to institutions or organizations which don't quite exist, and it's all done for the sake of this beautiful fictional art narrative. Okay, so the question is, there is unreality and untruth here. but there is a deception, but the deception is for creative purposes. So this isn't probably going to offend anybody in any way. It's not an unethical issue in that sense, but it is an ethical issue, because the other thing we need to do as catalogers is we're also thinking about things like truth and reality and deception, and what are the responsibilities of our catalog and our classification to represent a reality? Is that expected by our users? So I think this often brings up a really big schism between the creator's wishes and the user's needs. The creator wants the user to be, you know, to be in this beautiful fictional world without realizing that it's not true. But the user might have a need to know that that expression didn't take place and that artist is made up and that's a fake newspaper and all of these things. And the idea of truthfulness and also the idea of unrealness as a type of information. So I think these are really beautiful examples, and they show us that ethics goes beyond although obviously possibly I would argue less important than some of the other issues we talked about today. The idea of ethics and cataloging classification also goes beyond groups of people and unethical behavior in that sense, and looks at artistic versions of what we might consider to be unethical, but certainly about reality and truth. So I just wanted to bring in this example because it's art, and also because I think it just shows you the extent of ethical discussions in cataloging and classification. So I think I have 3 minutes for the last 4 slides. That's going to work. So the wider context. So let's just take all this together and look at a few of the wider issues here. So we're going to go back to looking at everything now, the construction of our schemes and guidelines, and also our application of them. So this slide I don't need to spend too long on because it's the most important slide, but it's a slide I think that everyone knows about, which is of course the impact of their unethical cataloging classification. It leads to marginalizes communities. We get our users disengaged not just with that one book on the record, on the catalogue record, they become disengaged with the catalogue, and they become disengaged with the library, potentially disenfranchised from the institution. And what's really interesting is that users will generally not know that the reason we've got that offensive term in there is because someone over in America has made a rule about something. I know it's not as simple as that, but they don't know that we are governed by perhaps global rules, or their global considerations, or that our catalogue is 100 years old and we can't just change it. So they see the problematic term, the unethical term, which really upsets them and makes them feel othered. They see that term and think it represents what the library thinks now about them. And this is the problem. We don't have enough understanding of our library practices to even begin sometimes to have that conversation about how it's not us, we have to do this because of this, this, and this. So I think it's really, really problematic with these unethical aspects of cataloguing. Of course, there's the idea of the loss of neutrality, and it's going to be misleading and things like that. But neutrality is, of course, a little bit of an issue anyway. And you could even end up contravening policies of the institution. So this, and there are many, many more reasons. We all, hopefully agree that unethical cataloguing classification is a problem. So the question we get the whole time, on Twitter, in real life, in discussions, in papers, in conferences is, okay, let's do something. Why don't we do something? Well, so this is the negative slide. Sounds a bit pessimistic, next slide, but there's an optimistic one coming up after this. So why don't we do something? Well, there are a lot of barriers to making changes. Even if we all agree those changes should be made, or we're not happy with the ethical situation, there are some barriers. So first of all, changing something like Dewey costs money and costs staff. Now, Dewey has a staff, it has full-time, editors, or at least one, but not all of our classification schemes do. We've got classification with big, huge global classification schemes where everyone's a volunteer. So it's not so easy to change things, even if it's actually easy to work out what to do with that knowledge and change it. There are a lot of barriers to actually changing guidelines and classifications. And one of the reasons why there is sometimes reluctance to change the creation of our schemes and our guidelines. So this is the kind of the design of the schemes problem. One of the reasons is that every time you change or update a classification scheme, potentially every single one of those tens, hundreds of thousands of libraries who uses it needs to act on that change. And anyone who's been involved with a reclassification project, which randomly was also the discussion class today and this week, been teaching on reclassification too, one of the issues is that we all know how complicated and difficult reclassification projects are. So one of the barriers for change, of course, is that you know, if you change the scheme over in America, then all these libraries around the world might need to change. And the political obstacles don't really need to go into, but from our institutions and nationally. And one of the biggest problems is global changes. If you're relying on outsourced records without, you know, which all link to an authority file, and you want to do something by yourself, then that can cause a problem. And really and truly, one of the biggest problems, as usual, is money and resources, making changes. If you make changes, then you can decrease the efficiency of your library, particularly if you were relying on global cataloguing before, and now you're having to make local changes to be more ethical, which is great to be more ethical. It can be a problem, and people lack resources. So it brings another problem up, which is, say we recatalog some things and say we reclassify some things to be more ethical, and then our backlog grows by a year. And we've got things which are in the backlog for 20 years rather than 19 years, which is bad enough. There are ethical issues with having cataloging backlogs as well, to do with, you know, resources being hidden away. So basically there are no easy answers. So although we might want to change our systems and want to move towards more ethical behavior in catalog and classification, there are a huge number of barriers, and it's usually very, very complicated. I don't have time to go through the changing heading illegal aliens example, but just to say, this is an example where we want to change the heading locally within libraries, even if the Library of Congress won't change it, but it does bring consequences. Many libraries have changed it, but there are all sorts of consequences about what you do with downloaded records coming in and things like that. But let's be positive now. So that's all the slightly pessimistic stuff, and hopefully haven't left you too sad. But positive thing number one, lots of ethics related projects in the UK libraries, and actually, sneak preview, ARLIS is hoping to, we are as a committee organising some workshops about some of those projects, and a lot more as part of a whole ethics themed program in the spring. So, you know, we hope you can hear more about those as part of this, as part of ARLIS and then these series of events. But just to say, it's so positive. There are so many ethics related projects going on in UK libraries. So that's a reason to be very positive. And not just the fact that there are projects, those projects often involve students, a wide variety of stakeholders as well, staff outside of the library, not just cataloguing staff and classification staff. Generally a wide variety of people, so it's getting people together to talk about cataloguing and classification. Excuse me, which is always a good thing. I would just say this slightly, maybe controversially, but I would say that the fact that ethics is included in the cataloguing and classification teaching in LIS programs, I can only really talk about UCL, but I have to say I've taught it, the other two programs, LIS programs I've taught at, definitely included ethics in there. But certainly at UCL, we talk about the ethics of cataloguing and classification almost every single week, some weeks really focusing on it, like this week's actually, as it so happens. So, you know, it is being discussed, it's being talked about, it's there. We've had some brilliant discussions with UCL students about the ethics of cataloguing and classification. Just to say that those systems, places like Dewey, they're opening up. They want people in the community to give them requests and suggestions. They're going out and talking to Indigenous communities to talk about the best way and the most effective way to arrange their knowledge. This is really changing and happening. So criticisms, which would have been true of people like Dewey, the scheme management 10, 15, 20 years ago, may not be true now. People are opening up. And of course, the fact that you're all here and still here, even though I'm slightly overrunning, and the fact that you're all still here shows there's just no shortage of interest and enthusiasm. So there's so much to be positive about, including the fact this is my last slide. That's a very good reason to be positive. So concluding points. I would say there's a division between the ethics in the design of the systems and guidelines as opposed to dealing with a specific resource collection or library. A little bit of crossover between them, but I think it's quite helpful to work out which of the two we're dealing with. We're often dealing with one or the other with maybe a bit of crossover. I would also say that there's rarely a straightforward answer to an ethical problem in cataloguing and classification. You do one thing and then it has an impact. It takes time, it takes energy away from another project. You open up a new ethical issue, you end up adding to your workflow or making a more complicated workflow. So it's just a slightly cautious note to say that I think, you know, there aren't usually straightforward answers. Occasionally there are, but it's not usually a straightforward answer. And this brings me on to the third point, which any changes and mitigations you have for the really difficult, problematic ethic things often have wider consequences. And it's just a recommendation to be aware of those and to think about those, and also to write articles about them as well and add to our knowledge about them. And I would just say, really, it's my final point, to be part of the changes, I would argue we are best armed when we have an understanding of the past, how these things got there. We have an understanding of the conceptual background mechanics. We understand this is a problem with hierarchy, this is a problem with terminology, this is a problem because the LCSH rules written 60 years ago, so you have to put this heading in this language, you know, things like that. So I think that's really important. And if we're also armed with knowing about the potential impacts, even though we might still do the thing, at least we know what's going to happen. I think that's a way we can arm ourselves to go out and make changes. And so, and that's my final point, apart from to say, and this was an introduction, very quick one, but not quick enough. This was an introduction, but we are going to be doing some ARLIS events organised by the Cataloguing Classification Committee in spring 2022, where we're hopefully going to look in detail at some case studies of specific cataloguing classification ethics projects, which will, and hopefully this today has been a framework and a structure of the landscape for which we can now see some, later next year, see some of the specific projects which are going on. Thank you. I know now Victoria's going to take over questions, and I'm a little bit later than planned.